Welcome. So this is the installing K2 demonstration. K2 is a little bit different from Nintex in that it has quite a few self-extracting installers. Notice these K2 actually have version numbers on them versus the Nintex ones that don't. I think it's pretty easy to figure out if you got the right ones or not. You see there's four different ones here. There's the K2 Black Pearl server, which is the core. It does not typically run on the SharePoint boxes. Typically set up your own box for it. There's the K2 for SharePoint stuff that will make it so that SharePoint can talk to the Black Pearl server, and anything that supports the smart forms for K2. So if you were to actually click on one of these executables, it's just a self-extracting extractor, and it creates these folders. And so the first thing we do here is we need to install the K2 Black Pearl server. So we'll come in here, we'll start the launcher. Now, one of the steps that you get as you make it through this installer is it's going to need to create databases, and it's got quite a few steps in the wizard. And what you'll end up needing to do is to ensure that whoever you're running this as, you're logged on to the Windows machine as someone that can actually create databases on your target database server. So this installer takes a moment to load. I've done some pre-work already on setting up prerequisites, and one of the things that is the easiest for you to do is to actually download something like SharePoint Foundation and actually fire that off. Notice this is also Windows Server 2012 R2. You would need to have the Foundation SP1 2013, and you would do all the prereqs for that. That's going to install all the IIS components and any other miscellaneous pieces. And I've found that that's a much easier path to go down than to simply go and let K2 tell you what you need to install. Doing that path, though, when you would get to this next step after this, and it checks for the prerequisites, it would actually tell you that you're missing MSMQ, and so you would then have to stop this install process, go into computer management, and add a new role feature, and make sure you had MSMQ in there. Now, for what I'm going to do here, the install folder is actually very important. And the reason that's very important is that it generates based on the path you're installing here. Mainly it's based off the path itself. It will generate the system key, which you then use to get your license key from K2. In this case, I'm going to do a custom installation, and we'll see that this is actually activated, so I can select K2 Black Pearl because I have all of the dependencies installed. If I did not, then I would see that this was not possible to be actually selected. So it is, so we'll continue on, but you'll notice other things are not available to be selected either because I don't have Visual Studio installed on this particular box. So go ahead and click Next. At this point, it's going to ask me for my license key, so I'll enter that. So now we get to select whether we want to actually start to set up a farm of different K2 servers. In this case, for this environment, I'm just doing a standalone K2 server. Whether we want to use Windows or Kerberos, we'll go ahead and select Windows. Any ports that you want the services to run on. I'm not running as an account that can really do the SPNs at this moment. So we'll click Next. And SPNs would be for the Kerberos anyway. And then this is an interesting step. This is not something you would have had to done in Nintex land. We have to actually go, and I've pre-done this already, but you would need to go into IIS and make sure that you've set up an actual site in here for K2. And so I've already done that. it sees that, so we'll say, do we want to use an existing or do we want to create one? And so we'll go ahead and say let's use an existing one. Possibly could give us an error on bindings. We'll see. It's always good to have full DNS, but at the same time, this adds a layer of complexity in that if you're going to use SSL on that web, here's our bindings. So if I did want to use it, then I need to make sure that I get the SSL certificate loaded up onto those particular IIS sites. Next step is the app pool, which is fine. We'll use the existing one. The app pool itself has to be set up a very specific way. So in this case, a couple, there's in K2 Classic Mode 2.0 that would have to be used, and there's also a .NET 4 that ends up getting created. If we want to use SQL Server reporting services, I don't have that set up in this, but that would take some time to also set up, but we're not going to do that here. If we want to do CRM integration, we could do that. So you can see there's quite a bit of difference between the install process of Nintex and K2, that Nintex just kind of gets everything installed and then you can configure later, whereas going through the K2 installer, you need to know a lot in order to really configure everything as you go through the install process. Not to say that you can't go and change things later, but definitely adds to the things you're going to need to know. At this point, it's now going to say it's going to create the K2 database, so I have to point it off to the database server. It notices that it now needs to create that database, so we'll move on. And then actually going in and entering in our passwords for our K2 accounts here. Great. And if we want to use Exchange, we could do that. Go ahead and skip it. Just simply use SMTP. Again, you would need to know your Exchange settings at that moment in time. And then we get to the point where it knows that it needs to do an install. So we'll click Next. It's going to prompt us for an IIS reset, which is fine. And then it's going to do its setup. And the setup doesn't take too long. Obviously, we would need to go, and if we were going to create a K2 farm, we'd have to do this same setup to do kind of redundancy of the K2 farm. We'd have to do it at least one more time. And so this amount of time that I've taken here is about 8 minutes to make it through to this point. Probably take another minute here for this to complete, and then I'll have another screen after this, so about 10 minutes. But there was a lot of pre-setup that I had to do that in reality was probably about 30 minutes, if not more, of doing the getting IIS set up and doing the SharePoint prerequisite installer to kind of get this server to some point where K2 would actually work right, and then also installing MSMQ. Now there's another step after this where we'll see a screen that will kind of do a analysis of what has occurred, and it will prompt you and tell you there's a lot of registry keys, there's different settings that need to be done on distributed coordination server. So there's a lot of other steps that are involved. So this process of getting K2 installed is about an hour, whereas the Nintex one, since it's all SharePoint solution based, really is just the amount of time it takes for the solutions to get deployed to all the servers in the farm. So Nintex is a lot more simple from that standpoint. So eventually you should see all greens, and then that means it's installed it. Now I'll try to configure each of the items. this point it hits it's creating the K2 database. I've seen instances where I'm not sure exactly what happens with it, but it doesn't fully create the database and all the stored procedures. I'm not sure if it's going through some kind of install this version, do an upgrade, do an upgrade, do an upgrade. I see a lot of products that do things that way. So I've seen it to where it'll create this database, but it'll be missing stored procedures for the services to start. And I think it's kind of one of the later versions. I think it's .2 probably fixes that. So we've made it all the way through, green check marks all the way for configured. And now it's just doing some updating, moving some DLLs into the GAC. And now that it actually made it through the configuration, it's now moved on to a process where it's walking through and doing some analysis of what has actually happened and checking that all the services are started, all permissions, registry keys are set up properly. If you have a problem, they do end up having some pretty good documentation on some things. As a good example, the message queuing. If you were to click on each one, if you had an error, you'd be able to click on this link and it takes you to a help file, and that help file will actually show you what you need to do in order to fix that particular thing. In some cases, you would actually be able to select on an item and possibly be able to say repair, and then that would do the work for you to actually go and get the items repaired. All of this looks okay. One of the big things I've had issues with before is that the service doesn't start, and it could be because the database is not created properly. It could be the config file didn't get tokenized properly. I've seen that happen. So there's any number of things that actually could have happened through this whole thing, but this one looks good. And so now we have an actual K2 Black Pearl is configured. So the next step is to actually go and do the SharePoint, K2 SharePoint install, and then the smart forms. And clicking on next, we see that setup has completed successfully. So hit finish. And again, that's just the K2 Black Pearl part. So now we go back in and we want to see if we can do the K2 for SharePoint as well as the smart forms and the control pack. So let's attempt to do the K2 for SharePoint. Similar process. There's a launcher that we would select, and we'll do the K2 Setup Manager. Click Next. Hit our agree, and we're going to see that missing some dependencies here. So we've got the Black Pearl server, but in order to do the SharePoint, we have to do the smart forms, and then in order to do that, we actually have to do the control pack. So I'm going to go click out of this, cancel, and let's go back and do those. So that's just one of those things I'm showing you because you may or may not know the exact steps of what you have to do in order to get the K2 set up. So adds another little bit of layer of complexity there. The neat thing about looking at Nintex is that you can run workflow without forms. You can run forms without workflow, but they really do work best together. So let's go and do this. This is the control pack. And again here, now it says we need to do the smart form server. Alright, so just showing you, giving you an idea of the process here, that you may or may not know exactly what you need to install in the order of which you install it. So let's jump back. Let's do the smart forms now. And the smart forms is also going to have a separate license. to it, that you would have to similarly have a different system key. And that system key, it's the same logic, it's just that the smart forms doesn't point to the same location that the workflow does. So in this case, it's saying, okay, great, we got all these things, looks good. Say yes, we want to do that. And then I got to go point off to our database server and everything, so I'm going to do that, and then we'll move on to the next wizard. Okay, so we knocked that out. It found the K2 database. Now I have to put the license key in. Once that's done, we're going to piggyback off the same existing website that we created before. So we'll say K2. Similar bindings. At this point, we need another app pool, so I will add that in. And then we have a runtime site, so we'll put that in the same spot, K2. Similar bindings. Same app pool. And now we're ready to do the install. Looks good to me. So again, this video is sitting at about 17 minutes, but the total process, we'd be sitting somewhere around an hour, probably an hour 15, an hour 20 at this point. So let this do its install in configuration. And so once it's completed each of its configuration steps, it'll move into this configuration analysis phase like it did for the workflow. And this one should run a little bit faster than the workflow one. This is another one of those where you'll realize that running the SharePoint prerequisites would have helped you a lot with some of these settings. So as this runs, in this respect, this configuration analysis tool from K2 is pretty cool. They're checking for a lot of different components and the ability for you to go and select something. In this case, this application initialization role. It says it hasn't been installed, so if you want to repair it, go ahead and click repair, and it will do its work for us. So we'll attempt to do this. If it's something that they don't have a repair routine for, as I mentioned earlier, you can select on stuff. Sometimes you'll see the link at the bottom that will bring up the help that will then walk you through what you need to do to actually configure that particular item. So that's a nice part about their install process. So in this case, the repair worked just fine. Now I have a green check mark for that. So running through this, we'll see that just some warnings in here telling me that anonymous authentication is enabled. Not a big deal. Some virtual directory stuff, again around anonymous, which is not a big deal. HTTP activation is not installed, so that's a good one. So let's go ahead and repair that. And of course it installs that. That one turns to green. And if we scroll down, it's just left with the anonymous now. And this one came back, so we'll hit repair on that one more time. And it looks pretty good. So I think we're okay now. So then I'll just hit next. Setup completed successfully. Perfect. So now our smart forms are installed. Next step, there is still one more thing to install. So come over here and we will install the SmartForms control pack. And we are sitting at about 20 minutes on this particular video. And in reality, again, we're probably somewhere around the 1:45 mark, so an hour 45 minutes in terms of getting K2 set up. And I would imagine after this and getting the other SharePoint component, we will be right around 2 hours. So get the database in here. And it's ready to install the control packs. And then it will do the install. These are just some extra controls that are going to get installed for SmartForms. So it shouldn't take too terribly long. And so that was the install. It's pretty fast. And now it's going to do a configuration of each of them. Similar process of everything all the way through, you'll notice. And now all those are configured. It's doing an IS reset. Did some applying some DLLs and updating, and now it's complete. So now we've got our SmartForms installed, the control packs installed, and finally now we go for the K2 for SharePoint. Again, all kind of similar setup, launcher style. Accept our agreement. We see everything is green now. So go ahead and click next. I'll have to do the database. Great. Makes it through, finds our database. Now it's going to do the install of our SharePoint components. It's going to install the CSOM and the online management shell for us. That's nice of them. Installs both the 15 and 16 versions. And then our online management shell. A quick IIS reset. And then it will go into the install. It's going to blaze through that pretty quickly. Move into configuration. Everything is configured. And again, another IIS reset. Now note that this is IIS reset that is on the K2 servers, not on the SharePoint servers. Whereas the Nintex is a SharePoint solution that would cause your app pool IIS to kind of recycle. And so once it's all the way through in the configuration, it'll jump to the setup is complete. And we have now successfully installed a single server K2 farm with the components of the Black Pro, the SmartForms, the control pack, and K2 for SharePoint.